Chapter 53 Sweet Spring. Aemond. In hindsight, Aemond couldn't decide which had been worse, the dreams themselves or waking up. The wedding was a fond memory, but the night proved less pleasant, both for what he remembered and what he couldn't. He'd laid in bed at Driftmark with his new wife, staring up at the drapings magic to appear like a night sky, while the enchantress herself had fallen asleep near instantaneously. Aemond wasn't positive how long he'd been awake, but eventually the glimmering stars above him began to bleed into streaks, as if they were falling. First one, then two, then more. And soon they were all shooting across the night sky. One star went further than the others, falling out of the sky to collide into a forest, sending fire and dust into the air. Or so he thought. At a second look, he realized the crash hadn't caused a burst of fire, but an eruption of birds. A whole swarm of them flew into the air, with red and gold plumage, singing a haunting lament which made the hairs on his arms stand on end. And that was when things got very weird. There had been a barrage of glimpses, moving forms, sounds and sensations Aemond couldn't keep up with, nor understand. How could he? What was there to understand when the strangest dragon he'd ever seen emerged from the forest? The red scales glittering like rubies were one thing, but the burning set of antlers protruding from its head made it look unearthly. Nothing akin to the usual horns and spikes. It was antlers, like a crown of fire. Yet there were no answers to the absurdity, as next Aemond knew he was gazing at a quaint painting instead, where the dragons depicted were moving around, one following after the other, gradually catching up. They weren't flying together, it was a chase. The dreams kept changing, not always restricted to queer visuals either. There were sounds, smells and sense of touch too. He heard a familiar accented whisper tickle his ear, softly, urgent. "I'm not asking you to give him a dragon egg, Aemond. I'm asking you to look after your family." Then a big black dog came sniffing around his legs, and when the hound looked up, blood was oozing like slobber from Fang's toothless maw, and his eyes were gouged out. He recalled a torn book on the floor too. It had been scorched and ripped, the pages barely able to cling together. "The Chosen One?" was written across the front. Then Hariel was staring at him, her eyes hateful and face twisted, merciless as only grief could be. "Your blood may be strong, but I need a true dragon." He reached for her, alarmed by it all, but she was but a passing moment, replaced by another. A shadow turned the world hazy and hard to make out, and when Aemond tilted his head back, wondering what was covering the light, he saw a cracked moon blocking the sun, only a few rays piercing through. A torn moon bleeding sunlight. As he watched, a sudden flash of light hit him across the face, like glimmering steel, and for a moment his eyes stung, so badly he couldn't see. The next he saw was Harrenhal from above, not because he was flying a dragon, but because it had been turned into one of his father's model pieces, akin to the one he'd made of old Valyria. He reached for the piece to examine the handiwork, noting that the model-sized Harrenhal left a bloody imprint behind on the table. Aemond thought there may have been more such brief snippets, where he was seeing impossible hybrids of beings and alien sounds, but there had also been the more interactive sort. One such Aemond remembered clearly was suddenly being in the company of Daemon of all people. "What's the meaning of this?" Daemon asked in Valyrian, looking at a dragon handler and a guard dragging a little boy into the chamber. "Prince Viserys broke into the egg incubating chamber," the dragon handler answered. There was a beat of tense silence, and then Daemon giggled, high and mocking. He looked down at the angry little boy. Laenor's son and heir was no longer a babe, but a very young, though frustrated, child. Daemon walked around the table, while the boy fumed, and then Prince Viserys' anger burst. "Everyone have dragons, even Visenya, and she don't want it! I should have Thunderstrike! I want to be a dragon rider too! Why can't I?" Dragons are for worthy Targaryens. Aemond nearly winced the same way Laenor's son did. Despite being yet another of Rhaenyra's sons, one of them, Aemond remembered what it was like to be the only dragonless prince. Perhaps that is why the dream changed, and he found himself on Driftmark, once more a boy of 10 on that fateful night he became unburnt. Aemond approached Vhagar, his stomach in knots and his heart hammering a drum roll, but he channeled the discomfort into a source for his determination. He would do this. Even the stupid foreigner who couldn't speak their tongue had a dragon, whereas Aemond didn't. It couldn't continue. It wouldn't. They'd never laugh at him again when Aemond claimed the biggest and most dangerous dragon of them all. Aemond reached for the rope ladder to Vhagar's saddle, but it was a move too far. He'd become too greedy too fast, and this was the instant he awoke the dragon. Her ancient eyes locked on him, the mighty beast evaluating the suitor who'd come disrupting her rest. She sniffed, her low growling reverberating through his soul, and Aemond felt it. Her. It seeped into his skin, her smell, her heaviness. The smothering effect could be mistaken for fear, but Aemond knew what this was. He was bonding. But no! He was already bonded. He had Vermithor, his true dragon. Vhagar snarled, raised her head again, opened her mouth, and all Aemond could think was, where was Sir Laenor? Shouldn't he drag him off soon? Where was Heriel? Aemond was alone. Dohaeris! The fire glowed in the back of her throat, a wave of heat smothering the air. Dohaeris, Vhagar! Lekeri! Threads of fire flared up like walls around him, entirely from the wrong direction. As stupid as it was, Aemond whirled on his heel, turning his back on the largest dragon in the world at the sound of his sister's scream. It had been a whirlwind, the core of his essence uprooted and shaken violently, and all these dreams hadn't felt like they were happening one after the other, but on top of each other, simultaneously, everything everywhere all at once. Even as a part of him was climbing up a rope ladder to Vhagar's saddle, thrilled and barely able to breathe for excitement, a third version of Aemond was simultaneously lying in a bed, soft hands around his member, coaxing him to her heat. His head felt heavy and not entirely alone, but perhaps it was because of the intensity of the green eyes watching him curiously. The weirdest part was how in the middle of sex, Aemond was somewhere entirely else too, standing within an inferno made up of a very different kind of heat. No dragon or lover in sight, only lethal fire. And the scream from earlier was still echoing in his ears, and he finally found the source. His sister was running for her life, clutching tight to a crying, dark-haired child. Helena! Aemond shouted at the same time as another Aemond had reached Vhagar's saddle, holding the reins, and shouted, Sylvess! And then he was flying. The world bled away into a river of other bewildering dreams. Terrible, heartbreaking ones, experienced at the same time as honey-sweet moments that were nearly as gut-wrenching because they were ripped away too. In this ever-changing stream of possibilities, neither cruelty or happiness could stay. Yet somehow what broke him wasn't the dreams, it was waking up. After myriads of alternate worlds colliding together, dragging Aemond along like a ragdoll tossed round and around a maelstrom, the piercing silence of suddenly waking up was deafening. Aemond had stared emptily about the dark room, the disorientation making him unable to tell where he was, what was happening, or even who he was. All he could tell was that he was breathing heavily, dizzy and sitting in a soft bed, but he had no reference of mind for what a bed was. The air was cold, but he struggled to recall the effects of winter, or discern it from the other seasons. It was compressed in a blurred heap. Once awake, he couldn't make heads or tails of a fraction of it. He'd sat there with both too many memories, yet no memories of a life at all to explain how he ended up there. There was a black-haired woman sleeping next to him, but who was she? Where was this? He had so many memories of her, yet none. He'd been clueless to her identity, but something nagged at him. telling him she was safe. This was fine. He'd woken up next to this stranger 1,000 times and one. There'd been several realities squeezed together into too narrow a place, leaving no room for him. One or the other had to let go of his shell, as there wouldn't be room for them both. So the dreams that awoke him so violently were slipping away like water in cupped hands. Maybe because some part of him had willed it. Maybe because a man's mind was never designed to hold on to them in the first place. Gradually there was light and space enough to find himself, and he finally recalled his name was Aemond. Aemond the Kinslayer. No! What in the seven hells? At the time it had been disorienting. In hindsight, it was terrifying. He remembered the feeling of connecting to Vegarvo, too lifelike and intimate. Even wakefulness couldn't shake it. It had been unnervingly real, and she'd felt so heavy, immense, distrustful, powerful, and full of a dark, bottomless rage. He'd needed to go see Vermivore and verify his memories, because there were conflicting impressions. Aemond dressed himself quietly so as not to wake the woman he still couldn't quite name, but was certain he cared about. If he could just play this out calmly and pretend everything was fine, surely it would come back to him. Outside the door, a knight stood guard, and the man could tell something was off with Aemond. He'd followed after him, and it was on the staircase Aemond remembered this knight had to be one of the Cargill brothers, either Eric or Eric. He'd stopped in his track, staring hard at the king's guard. He couldn't put his finger on why, but if this was the wrong twin, then that was bad, for some reason. Eric? Aemond asked. Yes, my prince. The quick accepting reaction reassured him. Sir Eric was merely expecting an order, not correcting him about a name. Though Aemond couldn't explain to himself why the exact identity mattered. Eric or Eric, what was the difference? They were twins. My wife, Aemond said, stilted. But since Sir Eric didn't react to this phrase, it must be right. Things seemed to be a bit clearer now, and he felt her name was on the tip of his tongue. You should stay and guard her. Ariel. The name suddenly clicked, as if it had never gone anywhere to begin with. I'm seeing my dragon. How come you wish to fly at this time of night, my prince? On your wedding night? Sir Eric asked, his expression concerned. Aemond shrugged. Even as he recalled, the others take him, but Eric was right. It was his wedding night. Yet Aemond didn't answer. He turned away and walked off whilst the shadows of alternate realities mockingly danced at the corners of his perception. Despite direct orders, Sir Eric followed after him, so Aemond settled for ignoring the knight. Feeling like he'd been here before, Aemond snuck out of Driftmark in search of a dragon. His main priority was to locate something defining, the most assuring truths, going beyond what could be heard, tasted, felt, or seen. Vermivore, Aemond whispered, an echo of the call reverberating through him. Aloud it was barely audible, but within him it felt aching to a plea, desperately needing to be heard, yet terrified the wrong being would answer. He marched blindly into the night, his breath fogged and the frosty ground crackling underneath his feet. In his wake, Sir Eric complained he hadn't had time to put on a warmer hat, which stopped abruptly at the sound of a deep, gravelly roar. A patch of the starry sky disappeared behind the massive wingspan of a dragon, heading directly for them. It was a crushing relief to see Vermivore's sharp angles and hear his rumbling roar. Enormous and powerful, and so much more cooperative than some others. He'd answered Aemond's distress and sought him out in the dead of night. The fiery heart of Vermivore's body sent the cold winter air steaming away. He soaked in the bond, imagining he could feel Vermivore's pulse beat in tune with his own. They soared through the night while Aemond put together the pieces of his fractured reality, everything slotting into the right places, or so he hoped. and that was when the waves of horror and disbelief crashed over him. How could he have forgotten his own name? His life? What happened? What could entangle memories and dreams so tightly Eamon couldn't distinguish between them anymore? He'd heard tales of men who were hit on the head and turned into lackwits, but he couldn't recall any injury. And physically, Eamon felt perfectly fine. Perhaps the ghost of an ache lingered around his eye, but otherwise there was nothing. Still, while they broke their fast the following morning, Ariel noticed something was amiss. "Are you going to share what troubles you?" she wondered. "You fly off during our wedding night and you've been distracted since you returned. Do you regret this?" Right then and there, Eamon almost told her everything, but the words wouldn't come. He'd sound mad, and Eamon could only imagine what she'd think. She'd finally agreed to marry him, only to wake up to tales of her husband losing his mind and forgetting who she was. It was an excuse so idiotic even Aegon wouldn't use it after a night of excessive drinking. When the silence stretched with no forthcoming explanation, Eamon did the only thing that seemed reasonable. He kissed her, deeply. Eamon had no desire to talk. He didn't want to think either. And Ariel was perfect. The exertion and pleasure of sex proved an excellent distraction as Eamon decided to forget the night. Determined that the only dreams which deserved his attention were the dreams he achieved for himself. In the weeks following his wedding, there were certain signs of better days to come, until one afternoon a white raven was spotted above King's Landing, heralding the change of seasons. Winter had passed into spring. The citizens of King's Landing welcomed spring like a dearly missed friend, returned from treacherous voyages. Since the winter had lasted a year, it was considered a blessedly brief one, but Eamon was relieved all the same. It was a different way to wake, and not only because he'd exchanged the furs and blankets for soft, airy sheets. No, it was 1,000 minor things combined. Eamon didn't need to dress in 5 layers to walk down a hallway, and the windows were no longer barred to trap heat. The shutters were taken down and the windows cleaned, allowing sunshine from the longer days to brighten the gloomy rooms of the Red Keep. There were bird songs, and the re-emergence of buzzing insects made Helena beside herself with excitement. Despite her unfavorable living situation, it eased Eamon to see his sister gush over the spider she found crawling on her nightstand, acting as she used to when they were younger. The bite of frost faded into warm wind, fragranced with traces of blooming flowers. Eamon could enjoy daily fruits and rich vegetables to break his fast, and he could practice outside without risk of catching his death. It made squiring under Sir Harold significantly less bothersome. Eamon could ride into the woods on horseback and fly further with Vermifort, which was a blessing when he spent so many of his days in the air. Flying to Dragonstone, flying to Cracklaw, and even flying across the narrow sea. And for nearly all of these travels, his wife flew at his side. During one of these trips, Eamon leant into his saddle as Vermifort stretched out his wings and tilted into a turn. Port Point had come into view, and Eamon confirmed they were landing. Vermifort was agreeable enough, and his dragon started to control descent, using wide loops to gradually lose height. In contrast, the small shadow that had been flying over them did an abrupt nosedive, and then a blue streak of color plunged straight downwards. Eamon chuckled. Ariel had no one to blame but herself. She'd been the one to teach Norbert her tricks, and now she was doomed herself to sudden jostling and aerial acrobatics. Norbert was a youngling that still liked to play and wasn't always aware of how fragile her bonded human was compared to herself. By the time Eamon climbed off Vermifort, Ariel was trying to comb her windswept hair while Norbert was sniffing around, her spiked tail smashing agitated into the ground. Eamon frowned. "Her tail, Ariel!" Ariel looked over her shoulder, scurrying back just before she got sideswept. Annoyed, Ariel yelled at Norbert in the tongue of dragons. He was clueless to what was being said, but judging by her expression, Ariel was scolding the dragon somehow. Norbert hissed back, sparks erupting from her mouth and making Harald take another step back, and now her wand was in her hand. For a moment, Aemond worried his wife was about to try and wrestle with her dragon, which would be suicide. Fortunately, she was able to resolve matters through that speech of hers, and Norbert flew off again. What was that? Norbert is being such a turd, Harald exclaimed, catching up to him for a stroll back to port point. Her fiery little highness is of the opinion that Cracklaw is boring. She doesn't like it here? Harald reached for his hand, entwining their fingers. It's the lacking company. There's Vermivor and Vhagar, neither of which he'd be idiotic enough to challenge. She gave Vermivor a rueful glance, as if that was self-explanatory. Vermivor was a much calmer dragon than Norbert, but if Vermivor was to sit down where Norbert happened to be, the blue dragon would die from the crush injuries. Hagrid would never allow her around Little Morning or Thunderstrike either, so she's mostly alone. As much as she complains about him, I think Norbert misses chasing Vermax, Erix and Ebryon around. She says she wants to fly to King's Landing too. Why? I think she wants to fight with Moondancer, like they used to on Dragonstone. Moondancer never missed a chance to fight back, and Norbert wants to fight Sunfire too. They got along rather well, as they kept trying to bite each other's head off. She shook her head exasperated. Honestly, I've raised such a bully. Aemond smirked, giving her hand a light squeeze. Dragons only care about strength. Mayhaps, Harald agreed. Though speaking of Sunfire and his rider... She looked at him pointedly, and Aemond's stomach tightened, suspecting he knew what was coming. Did you speak with Aegon about Dracarys? I didn't see Aegon. There wasn't time during the visit. Besides, the boy is settled at Driftmark with his mother. Their life is there, he pointed out. There was an irony to be found here. Ariel had insisted she wanted to delay with children of her own, yet with Aegon's bastards she was in quite a rush. Ariel had known of the bastard for years, but she'd seen the boy Dracarys during their wedding on Driftmark, standing amongst the small folk on the docks as they left, with a mob of curly, silver hair and stained worn clothes. And after that, Ariel wouldn't let the matter be. It's not enough, and you know it. Aegon will never take care of his son, Ariel said. He wouldn't before his injury, and the likelihood he will now is next to none. He may not even be... He is... Ariel cut him off, rolling her eyes with exasperation. Everyone knows it. They've known who the father was since before Dracarys was born. Princess Rhaenys told me. Besides, all you need to do is look at the boy. He's your brother with small. She wasn't wrong about the similarities, which went beyond the lad's pure Valyrian coloring. The shape of his eyes, the brow, the nose, the face. He did take more after his father than is made of a mother. Why do you care so much about the ragged little bastards? He asked rhetorically. As your wife, that ragged little bastard is my nephew too. Aemond frowned. And now you expect to raise him from rebel to prince? I'm not asking you to give him a dragon egg, Aemond. I'm asking you to look after your family. The breath caught in his throat. Aemond had heard those words before. The dream returned with aching clarity, and the words with it. He tried to repress it and everything else from that night, but now the words sprang back up like a trap. They were the same words, the same tone. He'd heard it moons before it happened. Aemond didn't know what his expression was like, but Harald mistook it for something else. You have all the means to see it done, yet you choose not to. You all do. Aegon, Rhaenyra, the king, the queen. Everyone has let that boy down. But why? How come it's such a challenge to provide the bare necessities for your nephew? Harald challenged with poorly disguised judgment. Growing up, there was no love between me and my aunt and uncle either. They hated me and the feeling was mutual. But when I was orphaned and helpless at 1 year old, they took me in. I was never happy in that home, mostly miserable actually, But still, they sheltered me, fed me, clothed me, and kept me alive. That's more than I can say of you." Aemond blamed the dreams. Those damned words unbalanced him in the middle of their discussion, and his wife had taken advantage of it. Before he was certain how, he'd relented. The Dragon Point was a long way from finished, but he did need small folk to serve throughout the construction. The children were too young, but their mothers could be put to use, and it wasn't an unreasonable request. Ariel wasn't suggesting they come live in the Red Keep. She was merely requesting he look out for his kin. Even if it was from a solid line, they were descendants of Aegon the Conqueror. The issue was, of course, that Dracarys wasn't Aegon's only bastards. From years and years back, Aemond knew of a couple bastards his brother sired, both dead. There'd been a sickly girl who died before her first name day, and then there was that maid at the Red Keep who died in childbed alongside the babe. After what befell her, the queen made sure the servants Aegon took to bed were given moon tea. Their mother's preventive actions had likely spared the realm a whole legion more of Aegon's bastards, but a few lovers had slipped through the queen's fingers. Aemond located a boy from a whorehouse named Gaiman, and another girl named Lila. The boy was confirmed by Sir Eric, but Aemond wasn't certain of the girl. The toddler spotted a mop of frizzy, sandy blonde hair without a single strand of silver. Yet Lila did have purple eyes, and when asked about her parentage directly, a bewildered Aegon confirmed he'd bettered the tavern when she birthed Lila. The moon spent injured and locked in with the maesters had turned Aegon gaunt, frail, and pale, resembling their father's pallor more than their mother. His brother looked a pathetic wreck, and it was near unbearable to behold. This was no prince of the realm, no dragon rider, it was barely a man. It was a depressing reality, but the wreck in front of him was also an improvement, seeing as Aegon was no longer in mortal peril. Suffering Aegon's company usually left Aemond irritated even on the best of days, but being confronted with how broken he'd become, the frail exterior reflecting the uselessness within, made it worse. It's why he hated visiting Aegon, and could only be convinced to do so when he had a purpose. They had little to discuss, and any words of comfort would be nothing but empty lies. "Why do you want to know of my bastards?" Aegon questioned, scooting up on his bed. The sheet draped over Aegon's lap shaped around his remaining leg, but laid flat where the other should have been. "What are you up to?" "As a concerned uncle, I'm merely making sure my brother's bastards aren't starving on the streets," Aemond said while looking over his brother's belongings. His new cane was propped up against the nightstand, and there were ropes tied from one bedpost to the other for Aegon to grip whenever he needed to get out of bed. "And what will you do if they are?" Bland eyes watched Aemond with dull accusation. Aemond picked up a jar standing at his brother's nightstand, pretending he was inspecting it. "Hagrid has offered your bastards a place at the Dragon Point," he explained. "They'd be fostered under his care." "Lord Rubius?" "He prefers Hagrid, actually." From the corner of his eye, Aegon faltered, something like disbelief or confusion flickering across his face. "Of everyone, I'd assumed you especially would keep them where they are." "How come?" Aemond smelled the jar, his nostrils swelling with a sharp twang of milk of the poppy. Was Aegon still being filled up with his horseshit? He eyed Aegon, trying to ignore the pathetic exterior for what lay beyond. His brother seemed lucid enough, but then again the jar was full. Perhaps it wasn't quite time to take his potion yet. "Because it's none of your concern?" Aegon spat, as if he needed such reminders. "Because they may be mine, and so, frankly, I presumed you'd prefer they disappear into obscurity than purposely bring them to everyone's attention." Aegon's lips tilted into a humorless smirk. "Considering the curse of what my claim means for everyone else." Why was Aegon impossible? Was his purpose in life to be a thorn in Aemond's side? Aemond reached over, tilting the jar over his head and oiling Aegon's disastrous hairdo with milk of the poppy. "You imbecilic waste of space." Furious, Aemond marched out of the room. Wait, Aemond, are you serious? You will see to them. What spell did your witch put you under? Or is this a ploy to get them together so you may drown them in a well? Aemond stopped in his track, dearly wishing he'd follow Aegon. Did he say Aemond would murder his bastards? Even as half a man, he remained an intolerable arse. Turning on heel and marching back to the bed, Aemond unsheathed his knife, the sunlight reflecting off the polished edge. Aegon went from confused to alarmed, and he jerked back in his bed. Aemond, what the... Aemond slashed out with focused force, cutting clean through the rope tied between the bedposts. His brother gaped, staring at the swaying ropes which were of little supportive use anymore. Aemond grabbed the walking cane for good measure. With a mocking smile, Aemond sheathed his knife, slung the clunky cane over his shoulder and ignored Aegon's indignant outcries as he walked out. Though he'd prefer otherwise, Aemond made sure to visit court to keep up with petitions, his squireship with Sir Harold, and to show his presence. But the majority of their time was spent at the Dragon Point. The seasonal change into spring meant they could start building. The minor village at Port Point doubled in numbers from the influx of crew arriving with the first couple of ships from King's Landing. Carpenters, stonemasons, and a blacksmith were sent along for the constructions, alongside hunters, guards, and cooks to keep the workers alive. But Aemond had involved the local smallfolk as well. His grandfather sent a raven to the citadel requesting aid for the construction of the Dragon Point, and in response, Maester Irvin was put on a ship and sent their way. He'd arrived on one of the 3 ships emblazoned with House Targaryen sails, which initially confused Aemond because they'd come alongside a 4th ship with the Grey Tower of House Hightower on its sails. It turned out all 4 ships had journeyed from Old Town, but only the Hightower ship was expected to return. If the 3 Targaryen ships are new and are bestowed to Prince Aemond and his lady wife as your wedding gift, a gift from Lord Ormond Hightower, he sends his regards, Prince Aemond. Maester Irvin explained in a thin, high voice as he handed over a scroll with the seal of House Hightower, which included a written letter that covered the same message. Not only were there 3 ships, but they were carrying 7 artfully crafted statues, an altar, and nearly everything required to build a new sept at Cracklaw. Your brother Daeron sends his regards too. Daeron arrived in Old Town? Indeed. I saw him arrive to Old Town astride the Blue Queen myself. He's returned to his squireship with Lord Ormond. Maester Irvin smiled timidly throughout the introduction. He spoke with a minor stutter and kept his eyes downcast. It didn't matter if it was a stable boy or a prince. Whomever he conversed with, Maester Irvin would sooner address their shoes than look them in the eyes. He made up for some of his timidness with height, standing a little taller than Aemond himself, but pudgy from doing little but sitting and reading throughout his 30 years of life. He'd spent over 2 decades building links in the Citadel, where his uncle had dropped him off at the tender age of 7. Those are very generous wedding gifts, Harold mused, watching the crew carry the intricately carved wooden statues of the ship. It is, Aemond agreed, even though it didn't surprise him that Old Town had an invested interest. Not only were they Aemond's kin, and the extravagance he displayed rather well, they remained one of the richest houses in Westeros, but more importantly, this was a new, blooming seat of power, and they wanted the faith to grow alongside it, especially as Hagrid was the Lord, a foreigner who openly didn't hold to the ways of the faith and had access to dragons. Oh, but if we're having a sept, what of the others? Ariel said distractedly. What do you mean? We'll need to make space for a Godswood as well. Hagrid was made to take a ship to Cracklaw too, keeping his oath to not fly Vhagar, while simultaneously making certain any nearby pirates didn't try their luck. Not only because the ship had a Targaryen sigil draped across the sails, but because Vhagar had flown after the ship from Dragonstone, hovering above it like a fiery knight and ready to roast anyone who crossed her bonded wizard. It made Aemond question the oath. Did it matter if Hagrid rode Vhagar or not? The bond seemed sufficient enough Hagrid might be able to weaponize Vhagar from the ground. The many arrivals meant the population of Port Point tripled, creating a village of tents on the outskirts of Port Point, which outnumbered the locals. Eamon's private tent was amongst them, but holding all the comforts required for a prince. He had also brought staff to see to the cleaning, hunting and food. But once they'd arrived, his guards ended up spending more time in his pavilion than Aemon did himself. Hagrid had brought along his magical chest, which was easily the best venues to camp in, even if it came with a certain sacrifice. "Separate rooms? She's my wife, Hagrid!" Aemon exclaimed in disbelief. "What are you trying to protect? Her virtue? You can't be so daft to think she's a maiden." Hagrid had gone beet red, and Aemon had taken a brief satisfaction in the following stuttering, but it was short-lived. Something in his face turned hard and dangerous. He knew Hagrid had been upset about their abrupt wedding, and heard he wasn't invited. But Aemon thought Hagrid was coming around. Apparently not. "You may be married, and you may have crossed a line you can't undo," Hagrid told him sharply, crossing his arms and looking down on him. Aemon swallowed through a bone-dried throat. Hagrid towered over the tallest soldiers. Without magic, Hagrid was a behemoth unto himself, and he made Aemon feel a frail toddler with a wooden sword. Was that why Vhagar chose him, instead of the speaker, instead of the bloodline? She'd gone for power. "But you're only 5 and 10, Aemon," Hagrid said, his voice soft and firm in a way Aemon wasn't sure how to interpret. He seemed angry, aye, and at the same time caring. "I don't mind you staying here, that's not it. Family looks out for each other, so you're always welcome, Aemon. But whilst you're under my roof, you follow my rules, and that both of you are too young to make me a grandfather. You have loads to do and experience, and it's never amiss to take a few years to gather some wisdom. Having a proper home would help too. So you may stay here with me and Hariel, but in separate rooms, or you're free to stay at your fantasy pavilion. Those are my rules, but it's your choice." He had been both furious and conflicted. He wanted to share a bed with Hariel, and it was his right. But Hagrid's acceptance mattered too, and Aemon was starting to understand Hariel better. As far as his wife was concerned, there was no greater sin than disappointing Hagrid. It was disquieting to find some of that must have rubbed off on him, as Aemon was starting to feel discomfort whenever he let Hagrid down too. He was kind, similarly to Hariel, yet not at all. He was direct and pure in a way some children were. Falling short of Hagrid's expectations of him felt like kicking a puppy. He was a good man, with a good heart, and in his own backwards way he was looking out for his family's well-being. Aemon respected that. And if his chest felt tight when Hagrid called him family, well, no one would know. He conceded to Hagrid's rules. The bathroom, the kitchen and a noiseless chamber where he didn't hear half the camp through the night was too convenient to pass up. Besides, Hariel was happy to sneak off with him whenever Hagrid was occupied. The sleeping arrangements weren't the only hurdle to overcome though. Despite having more than enough to do at Cracklaw, Rhaenyra hadn't given Hagrid leave from his duties at Dragonstone. Hagrid's new lordship didn't mean the dragons under his care stopped needing supervision, but he couldn't possibly do both at once. The compromise was for Hagrid to bring his work along to the Dragon Point, even if there were no facilities, dragon handlers or systems in place to see to their needs yet. They'd have it eventually, but they hadn't had time to build any dragon sanctuary. Yet both Morning and Thunderstrike were brought along, and Hagrid was under orders to hatch another egg too, all the while building the Dragon Point. If Aemon thought Rhaenyra possessed a strategic bone in her body, he'd assume it in an attempt to sabotage them. It was impossible to call her out on it though. Superficially it looked akin to an act of trust and honor, but if it hadn't been for Hagrid and Hariel's magic, it would have turned into a fiery massacre. What else could be expected when forced to bringing two unruly dragons into a camp of flammable tents in a wooden area? Hagrid couldn't leave the dragons either, for their protection as much as everyone else's. He needed to keep them close, but he also needed to be available at the construction sites, and it was not an ideal combination for anyone involved. Simultaneously, Aemond wouldn't credit Rhaenyra with enough wit for such schemes. Just too subtle and patient for a woman who couldn't prioritize the safety of her kids ahead of the instant gratification from lovers. What other mother allowed the man who murdered Laenor to raise Laenor's children? It certainly wasn't for the kids' well-being. But Aemond wouldn't put it past Daemon. If it was, Aemond was determined to have the last laugh. True, it was still the early days. The toddler dragons were a constant pain in the arse, and there had been some priority arguments to sort out. But thanks to the magic, the constructions were already a year ahead of schedule. Hagrid and Hariel had different priorities in the Crown's expectations, which had set off the first arguments regarding what should and shouldn't be built. Whilst Aemond ordered the Crown's workers to start on the Dragon Sanctuary and the castle, he'd been forced to share Maester Irwin's time and mind with Hagrid. Irwin would be the Maester serving at Hagrid's Keep, which was how Hariel roped the Maester into aiding her with Portpoint Village. Somehow, through the efforts of only Hariel, Hagrid and the Maester, they made more progress in a fortnight than Aemond had managed with 200 men working to clear out the site where their keep would be. Whilst the men cleared an old ruin for parts and to be reused, Hagrid and Hariel had taken counsel with some fishermen too old for Aemond's needs. After listening to their many grievances of how the newcomers were ruining everything, they'd also figured out where the underlying issues were. The port wasn't big enough to sustain the sudden boom of traffic, and secondly, the main well was running dry whilst the other had gotten polluted, along with several other issues. And then they'd started from there. Whilst playing fetch with Morning to distract her from trying to start yet another forest fire, Hagrid had gone to mend the old wells right away. Hariel had gone a step further, and Portpoint now boasted 2 new wells to accompany the influx of people, and for easier access to water in case of fire. They had also laid out rock foundations for 20 new houses to try and meet the demands. Though rock was tedious to mine, heavier to carry and slower to lift into place than more affordable options, Hariel wasn't faced by that challenge. Despite having plenty access to wood, Maester Irwin had talked Hagrid and Hariel into banning the small folk from building anything new with timber. Of course, one didn't have to look further than Morning and Thunderstrike to understand why he'd be so adamant about that. Fire didn't spread nearly as fast between stone houses as it would between wooden ones, and rock didn't rot. They also proved that practical expenses were not an issue with Hariel and Hagrid around. Hariel could cut the stone blocks out of the mountain with her wand, and then lift a whole carriage full of rocks and transport it back to the village. Work which would have taken a moon, Hariel could get done alone before midday. And what took the longest wasn't the labor, it was the walking back and forth. In the first week, the locals were distrustful. The influx of dragons, ships, staff, guards, and royalty proved overwhelming for a village that had barely seen visitors since King Aegon I came to get their support for the conquest. Yet thanks to the rapid efficiency in which Hariel and Hagrid improved that rabble of a village, even the simpletons had seen the benefits. The turn from quiet disapproval to open adoration a fortnight later was startling, but Aemond wouldn't complain. As their lady, it behooved Hariel to endear herself to the small folk, even if her methods may be a bit more hands-on than was proper. No one could fault the results. They had cleaner water and easier access. Hagrid took a look at the old dirt path leading from the village and down a steep cliffy hill to the port and went to work. First he evened it out before widening it to a stone-paved road, broad enough for both bridleways and footpath, flanked with drainage ditches to prevent flooding during heavy rains. They'd also magicked a deep channel as a path for the plumbing system, following along the drawings Maester Irwin made. For now it was still open, but their intention was to cover the sewer with a new road above it, which would hide the sight and smells. Though even closed, Hagrid could still stand straight within the tunnel. Aemond had initially opposed the sewer because of cost and priorities. The construction would take years and a fortune, and their keep in the Dragon Sanctuary was their main priority. The Crown had granted money for those builds, not the plumbing of Portpoint Village. But with the use of their spell tools, because Aemond had no better phrase to describe Hariel and Hagrid's way of constructing, Maester Irwin's calculations always came out favourable. Even if the Maester cautioned there were too many unknown variables for his calculations to be 100% accurate, each rough estimation showed the sewer would be about as expensive as a modest stone building in King's Landing. Not only could Aemond easily afford it out of his own coffers, but the cost of the sewer would pay for itself. There would be less maintenance costs, and it would pay itself back within a year or two, while the sewer would last for decades more. The numbers Maester Irwin provided spoke for themselves, and Aemond changed his mind, going from a firm no to wondering whether extending the sewer up to the Dragon Point was feasible. If it could be combined with the roads going from Port Point past their castle and up to the sanctuary, laying the groundwork for potential future expansion too, there was no immediate rush, but Aemond was starting to see the potential. Aemond had been optimistic about it the whole time, but now he was truly invested. He could see what Hariel meant. This could be something great, and it was becoming a dream worth working towards, far beyond his expectations. Initially, Aemond had assumed the Dragon Point would be a near-dead piece of land, akin to Dragonstone. Certainly the ancestral castle of Dragonstone itself was one of a kind, but everything else was barely a step above a sad travesty. The villages on Driftmark and Crab Isle had accumulated wealth on their private islands in a way the Targaryens only gained after conquering Westeros. Even after 400 years of Targaryen lordship, Dragonstone Village barely had a population big enough to run a tavern. Aemond could have settled for something similar. It's what he'd expected when he'd lobbied for this idea with his king father in Hagrid's name. He'd been determined to remain contented with a castle and a dragon sanctuary, but with a nearby village that didn't factor into anything, either for taxes or conflicts, whilst making his earnings back through trade across the Narrow Sea akin to something the Valyrians or the Celticars did. All because he'd underestimated the practicality of magic. Aemond had seen magic for its destructive use, how it could be used to defend or attack, how it worked alongside or even against dragons. But now he was being confronted with its power of improvements, what it could optimize and how. For each hurdle Hariel was able to wave away with her hands, Aemond's dreams grew, and he wouldn't make the mistakes his ancestors did. King Jaehaerys had always lamented the poor foundations of King's Landing, a city that expanded too fast without the proper groundwork to accompany the rapid expansions. The maintenance issues around the city were severe and costly, yet rarely amounted to more than subpar results. Nothing ever seemed to be fixed, only patched up, or waiting the next time it got ruined. King Jaehaerys had once expressed a desire to tear down King's Landing and build it anew from scratch. No, for Port Point, Aemond would look to the foundations of Old Town, a city that had stood since before the coming of the Andals, instead of the foundations of King's Landing. Hariel and Hagrid's increased popularity left the people demanding their attention and magic. Their magic could do wonders, making everything from digging out cave-sized tunnels, to mining stone blocks for buildings, to transportation of extremely heavy materials into child's play, but they couldn't do it alone. Hariel and Hagrid had skills but limited knowledge. They were not master builders and needed both local advice from those who understood the lands, alongside professional counsel from the Maester, so that whenever they used their magic, they used it correctly. It wasn't enough that their spells made pretty things. It needed to be functional to the people who'd actually be using it on a day-to-day basis. It was a collaboration where magical convenience was used to optimize the mundane necessities. Hariel's goal of this union of magic and practicality was to create systems that eased everyone's way of life. So, everyone were demanding their presence all at once, requiring their attention for this mundane task or the other, all day, every day, and it simply wasn't practical in the long run.
And I thought baby dragons were demanding. Everyone has been pestering me since I stepped foot off the boat. I know it's for a good cause, but this is exhausting. I told you, Hariel, didn't I?
Hagrid had exclaimed during last night's supper. The cooks had prepared honeyed boar, hunted from the Black Bark Woods while they'd been overseeing the completion of the new docks.
Remember what I told you the day I took you for supplies back home, in Diagon Alley? Now these muggles know about us, everyone will be wanting magical solutions to their problems.
Judging from his tone and the context, Aemond assumed muggle was the word for peasant in their native tongue. It was clearly true they were being smothered in requests, and he didn't blame them. While it was intruding on their every waking hour, what made it hard to argue against were the results. It was too good to turn down. But Aemond had to put his foot down when he found Heriel standing with the Maester Builder down in the sewer channel, measuring out pipe dimensions. Heriel may be a witch, she may be useful, but it wouldn't do for people to forget she was a lady. She was his wife. Aemond didn't care how effective it was, he knew how such a tale would be twisted. His mother would be horrified, and his nephews would laugh themselves silly if they heard Heriel had gone from a respectable lady at Dragonstone under Rhaenyra's care to digging sewers for small folk under Aemond's. If Heriel was to lend her aid, she had to find an appropriate way to do so. Aemond expected a heated argument when he brought it up, but Heriel had deflected his irritation before it could escalate to anything. Alright, I understand why it could be twisted into an unflattering tale. Though surely understand that I can't use my spells from afar. There's some things that simply can't be accomplished without me. Mayhaps Hagrid can do the transport and cave shaping, but not the drainage. He's not as good at charms as I am, and we absolutely can't make a mistake with this. Everyone would be made to suffer if some clumsy spellwork left us with a faulty sewer. Oh, what about this? What if I use my invisibility cloak whenever I'm down there? I could still do spell work, the project wouldn't be put on hold, but no one would be able to tell I'm there, or bring tales of a princess wife working in the sewers to your father's court. Aemond had expected exasperation, not as practical acceptance, as if this was an unfortunate truth, but nothing she found interesting enough to get worked up about. Fine, he agreed to the compromise, struck by how easy it was, and wondering which of them had changed the most for it to be that way. He suspected this discussion would have ended up in yelling not a year ago, but of late, every challenge could be overcome, every accident could be fixed, every argument avoided. Every discussion was solved with reasonable solutions that miraculously seemed to satisfy everyone. Everything was going smoothly. The lack of conflicts was honestly a bit jarring. There were days that peaceful, joyous hours felt unrecognizable, like pages out of someone else's life. Until Aemond returned to court for his weekly chores, and he remembered where he'd left the drama. The days of spring trickled by at a rapid pace. His schedule was always full, and so Aemond missed just how much time had passed until rudely reminded during a visit at court. He'd merely gone through the motions of his usual visit, stood through petitions, met with his connections, avoided Bela, and made some inquiries. But when he was about to leave, his mother had pulled him aside for a private word over supper. He'd wanted to fly home, where he could eat with Heriel and Hagrid in the magical chest, hearing what progress had been made, but instead... "You've been married 9 moons, Aemond," his mother said, looking so deeply concerned you'd think he was dying. "And your wife is yet not with child." The topic should not have surprised him. His mother had been hinting at it constantly for ages, but in the last moons the urgency increased after receiving a letter from Dragonstone regarding Rhaenyra. His half-sister was whelping again. Considering how Rhaenyra threw herself at her uncle once she ridded herself of Laenor, none were shocked to hear she was expecting. But by putting a babe into the shrew, Daemon had finally, truly secured his path to the throne. Something that was enough to give both his mother and grandfather sleep issues. The only upside was that if the brat turned out to be a boy, then Jacaerys, Lucerys, Joffrey and Prince Viserys wouldn't be able to sleep safely anymore either. Even that was marred, because Helena's betrothal to Jace left her in peril too. As with Sir Laenor and Lady Rhea, it wouldn't be hard for Daemon to arrange more accidents to befall those he found inconvenient to his legacy. As always, each of Rhaenyra's choices left Aemond's family in more and more danger. So, Aemond understood. For a multitude of reasons, his mother needed their side of the family to expand too. Since Aegon was more of a dead weight than ever before, and they had good reason to believe his king father was unable to sire any more children, the queen felt the duty fell on Aemond's shoulders. He could agree they were in a dangerous position, but... he and Heriel were finally happy. Why did this have to be marred by the shadow of his half-sister's never-ending parade of disastrous decisions? Things had been going well at Cracklaw, and Aemond was loath to burst their bliss. When I married your father, we had Aegon about 9 moons later. This is a deeply troubling sign, and it does not bode well. Lady Harrel should be in her best childbearing years, Aemond, and the court is... The court? Aemond spat, repressing the urge to roll his eyes. They were so adamant I married my wife because she was already with child. The sheep could keep their barbed rumors and speculations. Their opinions were utterly inconsequential. Who were they to judge their prince? That was then, and you can't blame them. If only it had been the case, then neither of us would have to suffer this conversation. We'd be in a nursery doting on your heir instead, she said pointedly. No, now there's speculations regarding whether your wife is barren. His mother's brow creased with lines of worry. She's not, Aemond said tiredly. How can you possibly know? His mother asked, exasperated. You married Harriel nearly at the same time Rhaenyra and Daemon married, but their babe is expected in a few moons. You said yourself Harriel was not conceived. Not once in 9 moons. After so long without a single conception, there may be some validity to it. She may be barren, and if that's the case... Don't! Aemond had to bite his tongue from saying more. Of all people, he could not tell his mother he and Harriel were sullying the sanctity of their marital bed with preventive actions against conceiving true-born royal children to strengthen their side. How could she see it as anything but a betrayal? They were in such a vulnerable, delicate standing. At the same time, the situation felt infuriatingly absurd. He had his mother barraging him for grandchildren at one shoulder, whilst Hagrid was acting a manic septum crying sin in his attempt to prevent the exact same thing at the other. Aemond, his mother said with a quiet intensity, no trace of backing down. She was driven by cause. I urge you, have the Maester examine her. Maybe there's something they can do, or is it... Taking a deep breath, his mother took his hand. I've been wondering whether I overlooked your teachings regarding certain aspects of life. I left your education to the Maester, but perhaps you didn't have time to cover it. Your marriage was quite unexpected. His mother's lips pursed in silent disapproval, but she continued onwards. Aemond wished she wouldn't. If it's not her fault, then maybe there's some misunderstanding in the way... Misunderstanding? Are you certain you know precisely what is required between husband and wife when conceiving a child? Where everything goes? Where to put... Mother! Aemond smacked away her hand, torn between embarrassment and a wave of rage. Of course I know how to fuck! His mother flinched, but Aemond didn't care. This was stupid! So damn stupid! 7 hells, my marriage is perfectly valid, and I'd thank you to stop nagging us. Harriel is healthy and there's nothing the matter. If the original contract was honored, we wouldn't yet be wed. There's plenty of time. His mother leaned back in her chair, worn and cold. If only it were so, my son. It wasn't difficult to understand his mother's standpoint. But as skeptical as Aemond had initially been to the agreement with his wife, it worked. Would they have gotten as far on Crackle if Harriel was with child? Surely not. The progress, the flying, the explorations and everything would be different, and he wasn't ready for that. Aemond enjoyed their new normal. He'd even put up with Hagrid's ridiculous sleeping arrangements. The mostly because it was hardly challenging to get around. They could have privacy at his pavilion, or the cabin on the ship gifted for their marriage, or the abandoned butchery the locals avoided for fear of ghosts. They'd gotten creative. Though this freeing easiness went beyond his marriage, there was also a drive to see the Dragon Point flourish. Aemond wanted to be a part of it, leave his mark in the foundations, not merely with gold, but with his ideas and efforts. Aemond had always been given the best. From meticulously wrought swords and armor, to finely cut jewels and expertly crafted furniture. But most of it merely appeared, and it had little to do with his own skills. Whether he worked hard or didn't give a damn made no difference regarding what he was granted. Now it did. To be involved made a difference for the end result. Seeing the changes from week to week was staggering too. He'd seen it all. From a ruin being cleared out, to the new foundations being laid, to the walls starting to rise. It gave Eamon another kind of purpose. A sense of success. It was a team effort, but for once, his efforts made all the difference in the world. Eamon wrung his shirt over his head, unlaced his boots and stripped off his clothes. Folding them once, he dropped them over a nearby branch as he glanced over his shoulder. At first he didn't see his wife, but after a moment he glimpsed her yellow dress through the green thicket. Ariel? Slowly Ariel appeared between two trees, nearly tripping over the thick roots, too preoccupied with her magic to pay attention to where she placed her feet. Ariel, he repeated, and she looked up, then down, then up again. You're naked, she stated, slightly befuddled. With her attention stuck on her spell work, Ariel had stumbled through the forest, only able to follow along because for most of the trek, Eamon had kept a steady hand on her back and guided the way. Aye, we're here. Her eyes trailed past him to the glimmering river cleaving a path through the blood-bog woods. The dark trees stood like crooked walls, twisting in arcs over the river. Sunlight streamed through the thick canopies above, making shimmering patterns upon the reflective surface. It was a perfect afternoon to go swimming. Threading over moss-covered boulders, Eamon peered out from a section of rocks where the river was deep enough he could jump in without fear of hitting the bottom, unlike the shallow sections further down where he could easily climb out once done. Eamon jumped into the clear water, with a splash submerging into the fresh chill. The water colder than the dry air and sun above, though it was not so bad he didn't quickly adjust. He swam back and forth across the river, enjoying the cleanliness and the way it seemed to clear his head. In the meanwhile, Ariel sat down and made herself comfortable on the rocks, her feet dangling off the edge to trace the surface with her toes. Won't you join me? Eamon inquired, reaching for her ankle and giving it a light yank. Let me just... Ariel trailed off, her frustration furrowing her brow. I'm almost done. You've claimed so for hours. Eamon didn't understand how her magic worked. Why this was giving his wife so much trouble in ways other magics that seemed far grander and more impressive, did not. However, Ariel said it was a piece of magic she had heard was possible to do in her homeland, but which neither she nor Hagrid knew the spells to actually perform, and so she was attempting to recreate it. If I can get this right, we'd be able to pump fresh lake water out to the fields for the growth cycles. But Maester Irvin can't finish his calculations unless I give him an example of what he's working with. And instead of pressure, I keep getting... Ariel cut off when a burst of bubbles erupted from her wand. Eamon stared, fascinated as the translucent, fragile structures bounced around her. They looked exactly like underwater bubbles, but inverted to exist in the air instead. Ariel glared at her stick like it had betrayed her. She waved it a couple times and all the bubbles popped. Eamon said. I think a break will do you well, my dear. Join me. I promised this would be done, Eamon, Ariel said, a slight annoyance in her tone. Did you promise to have it done today? Ariel sighed, the sound heavy. I just want things to be done. Too many of us are without a roof. We've been fortunate so far, with steady enough weather, but what if there's a storm? We're prepared. The lower keep has a roof, the houses... If there's enough shelter to see everyone through a storm, getting water out to the fields won't make a difference. But it would be for provisions, for food. We're too reliant on shipments. Where's the sudden urgency from? We're years ahead of schedule, my dear. Come swim with me, it'll do you good. Ariel bit her bottom lip, chewing on her words for a moment, and then deflated. Fine. I may as well take a break. I'm none the wiser on what I'm doing wrong. She put down her wand. Is there a current? She wondered. releasing her hair over the updo it had been trapped in. Like a river of ink, her long black curls spilled over her shoulders and down her back. Not a strong one. Alright. Eamon swam in lazy circles while she unlaced the ribbons holding her gown together. It tumbled to the ground, her shift following soon after. Ariel didn't try to cover herself anymore. She had grown bolder since their first night and didn't shy away from his attention. After slowly hanging her clothes on a branch next to his, Ariel dallied on the rocks, uncertainly peering down at the water. It's not cold if that's your concern. It's not that, she insisted. Do you promise not to laugh? I swear to not laugh, Eamon said, his mouth already breaking into a wide smile. She couldn't have missed his expression, but she spoke her piece regardless. I'm not certain I can swim. Eamon burst out laughing. You swore you wouldn't laugh! Ariel griped, flushing all the way to the top of her breasts. I've never tried before, but I know the theory. You've never gone swimming? Eamon asked. How is that possible? I never got around to it. My relatives never took me along to learn. What of Hagrid? He never taught you how during your time in Essos? Haven't you gone swimming on Dragonstone? It's an island surrounded by water. It shouldn't be possible. Ariel had such control of the elements in ways no one else did. She could walk through fire. She could fly through the air. Yet somehow she couldn't do something as basic as swim? Couldn't everyone swim? Eamon had learned when he was 5. The little stream on Dragonstone is too shallow to swim in, she said. And the sea has treacherous currents. I've heard of people who've lived their whole life next to the sea, but one fall off the docks and into the ocean dragged them away, never to be seen again. Even strong swimmers have drowned. Beginners are told to travel to the mainland to find calm bodies of water if they wish to learn to swim, and I never did. And Essos? Eamon murmured. Hagrid had his expandable trunk with a tub and shower. Why would I need a lake? He drank her in, admiring the play of shadows from the leaves across her bare body. I guess it falls to me to teach you, he offered. The Dragon Point is surrounded by water on 3 sides. I can't have my wife live in perilous dangers merely strolling along the shore. How chivalrous. What a shame Sir Harold didn't hear that, or perhaps he'd finally grant you that knighthood you seek. I beg to differ. I brought you here for the privacy. She gave him a knowing look, and holding tightly onto the rocky side, so not to slip under, Harold lowered herself into the water, the surface rippling out. They were at the deep end of the lake, not ideal for someone who couldn't swim, but she had him there to keep her afloat. Taking a gulp of air, Eamon sunk underneath the surface, and kicked his legs and rotated his arms to propel himself through the water. Like a shark honing in on a seal, he shot forwards until his hands found her soft skin. He emerged from the water with a giggling witch in his arms. She locked her legs around his waist, twining her arms around his neck and pressed her breasts to his chest. She kissed him in between giggles, trusting him to keep them afloat. Unfortunately, it wasn't feasible to have sex in water with no foothold. In his daydream of how this would play out, this had worked easily enough. But the logistics proved too awkward, so Eamon did end up teaching his wife to swim. Her first awkward paddling was entertaining to behold, but Ariel was a quick learner. Once she could navigate the water without aid, it quickly turned into a swimming race. When he won, it escalated into a water fight, as his wife attempted to avenge her loss. Eamon wasn't sure which of them won that final struggle. He managed to chase her up the riverbank. There was a tumble through the reeds, hands caressing and teasing, limbs intertwined, their mouths lapping hungrily, teasing moans and sighs from the other, and a laugh when they nearly rolled over a frog. Regardless, it could end in no other way but a very wet round of sex. And for that kind of battle, Eamon wasn't too upset to see it ending in a draw. Ariel mused, splayed across his lap. She was flushed and sweaty, but glowed with a mischievous smile. Eamon gazed up through heavy, half-lidded eyes. "So this is how you'd look with your mother's hair color," she laughed. Eamon ran a hand through his hair, his fingers getting stuck in the muddy tangles. Sex always made him sleepy, but Eamon forced himself to sit up while Harriel climbed off his lap. Her legs caked with sand and mud, and there were reeds and leaves tangled in her raven hair. He was exhausted, but Harriel's smile was infectious. Even looking like an utter Dothraki barbarian, her carefree happiness stood out to him. It was a stark difference from the pale, somber demeanor he'd been familiar with at court. Though it could hardly be called proper, rolling around in the mud, mingling with all sorts of people and skirting their duties, he knew that. But Eamon couldn't find it in him to care. She looked so fucking happy. He was happy too. After the mess they'd made, there was no other option but to take a second dip in the river to rinse off. They emerged back onto the riverbank, dressed in their shifts and procrastinating while the sun dried them. Eamon watched Harriel picking reeds into a bouquet, admiring how she still looked beautiful as a dirty mud monster. Of course, she was a beautiful woman, but like everyone else she had bad days too. Days where she was worn and drawn, and her hair was a disaster. When she woke up on the wrong side of the bed, murmuring an affronted bore, and mercy to have her dared cross her van. But then there were days like this, perhaps especially today, where she was liquid sunshine. Idly, he plucked out some strands of reed to join in her collection. Harriel took it from him and nimbly twined together a wreath of river reeds. "It's not as nice as your golden circlet, but..." Harriel trailed off and crowned him with it. "There." She brushed away drying sand from Eamon's cheek. "I believe that makes you my king of love and beauty." Eamon rolled his eyes, fighting the heat in his cheeks. There was something extra hearing him call him my king, even if she was being silly. The sun was dipping towards the horizon, the afternoon waning into early evening, and they got dressed before the insects came swarming. He helped Harriel tie the back of her gown, and she brushed her fingers through his hair to loosen the tangles in the back. In amicable silence, they began the walk back. "Are you flying to the Red Keep this week?" Harriel asked, lifting her feet over the roots of an old oak. "Aye. You'll have to come too. Mother invited you to join for her family dinner." "That's kind." "Don't be fooled," Eamon sighed. "Be prepared for a barrage of uncomfortable questions." "I expected as much. I got her last letter." Harriel trailed off and eyed Eamon. "Though, I think it should be fine. Or it depends." "Depends?" Eamon turned the phrase over in his head, unable to make it fit. "Yes." Harriel looked at him pointedly and said quickly, "It depends on why my moonblood is late." Her moonblood was late? Eamon halted. "Is something the matter?" "The matter?" she repeated. "I'm late, Eamon." Generally, Eamon had heard girls who did not have their moonblood were either too young or too old to have children. So what did it mean when Harriel stopped too? Eamon straightened. Surely that can be sorted. How long has it been absent?" He thought back on the last few moons. The last time Harriel had rebuffed his advances because of this was weeks ago. But exactly how many weeks? Strangely, the more worried Eamon became, the more confused Harriel seemed. The last one never came, but there was little for the one before that too," she said. "Perhaps it'll be back? Surely skipping one does not mean it'll be gone forever. Maybe it was something you ate. We'll have Maester Irvin examine you, or we could fly back to the Red Keep and have Maester Orwell's opinion as well." "Eamon!" Harriel grabbed his hand, making him face her. "Stop! Do you not know what it could mean?" "I would assume you're worried Eamon looked around for eavesdroppers, an old habit returning out of worry by the mere implication of his unexpected obstacle. What the hell was he supposed to do if his wife could not have children? Eamon whispered the last part. You're barren. To his surprise, Harriel burst out laughing. I don't see what's so amusing here, Eamon growled. What had he missed? Only young child girls who are not yet matured, or women who've dried up past their childbearing years do not have moonblood. And expecting mothers. Hale wheezed out between hiccups of laughter. I don't know why I expected you to know of this, but why would you? You'll never have to carry a child. The minister probably didn't think it relevant. But Eamon, when a woman is expecting a child, her moonblood usually stops. It's one of the biggest signs. It was? How did that make sense? It's still early, and I could be wrong. Maybe it really is something I ate. But it fits. Of late, we've been a bit sloppy. I think we may be expecting. Eamon took insult. He was not sloppy during sex, and he was still of a mind to argue the faulty logic of moonblood. How could the most solid proof of infertility also be a proof of fertility? That was just bewilderingly contradictory. None of that got expressed beyond a dismissive huff. Cut short because it was at that point the rest of the message finally dawned on him. The reason this was a discussion at all. Oh. Goosebumps ran up his back as Eamon's gaze flickered to her stomach, and he took a staggering step backwards. The point he'd wanted to argue flew his mind, leaving the peculiar sensation of blankness, as if his thoughts were bleeding out his ears and carried away with the breeze. Oh. She watched him with uncertain hope. He tried to return her smile, but it may have looked closer to fear, because Harriel tugged him close and hugged him. Reflexively, he enclosed her slender frame within his arms, and the warm familiarity that was Harriel. The sudden tightness in his chest made it hard to talk, but he wouldn't know what to say anyway. They had tried to prevent this. It failed. That was a good thing, wasn't it? His mother would finally be placated. How could they be so upset? But it was their duty. She was carrying his child. He'd be a father. But what about the dragon point? The first keep wasn't done yet. Where would they put the baby when they didn't have a home? Oh, fuck! He pulled her in, kissing her brow and soaking in her warmth. Harriel burrowed her face into his neck, holding on as fiercely as he did. A grounding force holding him steady as everything changed.